Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Lemaire. I'm a programmer at the American Cinematheque, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our virtual Q&A for the amazing new film, LAPSIS. We're very excited to have the brilliant filmmaker Noah Hutton joining us. Our moderator for today is Anna Wiener, who is the contributing writer to The New Yorker and also the author of the new memoir, Uncanny Valley. So without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome Anna and Noah.
Noah, hello. Good to see
Hello.
you.
Great to be here. Great to see you.
What a privilege. Congratulations on your film, LAPSIS.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I thought I'd jump right in with a really basic question that I realized I actually isn't straightforward to me, which was, what genre would you place LAPSIS in? When you were writing the film and working on the film, did you have a sort of sense of the of lineage or of some tradition that you were working in, or did that sort of emerge in the process of making the film?
Yeah, I really wasn't thinking about genre and like obeying the dictums of a certain genre, and I wasn't placing this certainly as like I'm making a sci-fi movie, which I think it has been placed kind of as like a sci-fi and then maybe mystery or comedy or whatever other attachments people want to put onto it. But I wasn't thinking about that, and I was much more thinking about maybe more of like a tradition of absurdism in cinema, and sort of like Charlie Kaufman worlds. And there was a film in 2012 that blew my mind called Holy Motors by the director Leos Carré, and these are worlds that just sort of like throw you into the middle of a somewhat absurd, if you start thinking about it and poking at it, the physics of like being John Malkovich. And it doesn't really like hold up to scientific scrutiny, but I think like that to me it's that kind of absurdism and world building by sort of just dropping you in the middle of something and then orchestrating a world of cause and effect around the character that makes sense somehow to you, but in the end you're left with a sense of was that the world I live in, or is it some other world? And it's not exactly placeable in time. I was just sort of in that space of wanting to create that type of world, and there is a tradition, I think, of that. And I think I've been very influenced by that, and those are the movies I love. So I would say that's what genre I was thinking of. But sci-fi, I think, has so many other attachments to it as a genre that I wasn't so interested in. But I think it's interesting to realize at a certain point that you are making a movie that people are going to think of as a certain genre. And then because then when we were in the editing process, I realized there are some like sci-fi cues that might be helpful here, like some ominous synth music, some sort of like there might be some tones that could help cue the genre a little more that I think are actually helpful for viewers then to orient in space a little bit. So I would say it actually was something I only started thinking about like in the editing of the film.
That's really interesting, because I do think that sort of defamiliarization happens in subtle ways. And as someone who doesn't work in this medium, I was curious how you were thinking about that, because writing about the near future or the sort of parallel present, I think raises a lot of interesting challenges when it comes to genre, and especially when you're writing about and I guess I'm saying writing, but I mean writing and filmmaking, when the topic at hand is technology, is the sort of surreal and, as you said, absurdist ways that capitalism exercises itself on social relations or forms social relations. And so it just occurred to me earlier this morning that I didn't actually know what you thought of in terms of the film being science fiction or not science fiction, because those lines often are so blurry and so unclear. So it's interesting that some of that happened in the sort of, I guess, is that post-production in that phase of a film.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I did want to ask a little bit about this, about making a film that is absurdist, or is in this kind of like eerie space of familiarity that also has a real political perspective. Was that something that you found challenging to get through? Did you sort of struggle with how explicit to be about that? I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting is that I think that it's a film that lends itself to analogy really easily. You know, I think the obvious response for me was like, oh, this is a story about the gig economy. But in speaking with you earlier and hearing some of the interviews you've done, it sounds like that wasn't even really on your mind. It was more that these sorts of narrative threads emerge when you are writing or making work about different relationships and social and economic structures under capitalism. So I guess I'm just curious how you thought about having a political perspective in this film and how you sort of went about deploying it in a subtle and sort of pervasive way.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me when I'm confronted with people or immediately the film being read as like a direct gig economy parallel or analogy is that I definitely didn't back into the story and coming up with this job of cabling and this world of connecting these transistors. It definitely didn't come from wanting to analogize the gig economy. And you know, listen, things seep into you as a human being in the world, into your ethos and the comments you're trying to make. So I definitely, you know, think that things have crept into and inspired choices along the way. But the actual original origin of this world and how I started to think about it came originally, honestly, from wanting to. I had written several other scripts, thrown them out, and one of the ideas I've been working with for a long time was like a very out there idea of like almost like the Pixar movie Inside Out, but a brain world, essentially like a world inside the brain with workers, you know. So I was gonna like and I have this like interest in neuroscience. I was gonna try to like make this like fantastical world of the brain happen and then create a story inside of it. I could never really crack that, and it always seemed like so far-fetched. But honestly, the act of cabling has much more to do with an idea that crept up in that world of thinking about like a kind of neuronal constant rewiring of a space, much more than it did like an analogy for the gig economy. But what happens is when you take an idea like that and you filter it through, well, how would this labor actually take place, you know, in a world completely saturated by the tentacles of our current type of capitalism with independent contractor labor and, yes, the gig economy, then eventually you get a lot of analogies, I think, that crop up naturally. But the actual mechanics of it were initially like brain inspired, which is, I don't think would ever read, and it doesn't have to, but it's where it did come from for me.
That's not surprising at all, given that it came from you. Like, that makes sense for you. But when you describe it, that's just incredibly heady and yeah, I would say to the outside observer out there,
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And not necessary to, like, there's no neuroscience or brain inspired anything that's necessary to, like, in the viewing of this film. It's just the honest way that it sort of bubbled up for me. And you know, I think the political comments that or any comments on our world today were just sort of like imagining. I had done one other tangent quickly. I had done this project for Times Square called Brain City, like back in, I think it was 2014, 2013. And it was like it was sort of, they shut down all the screens in Times Square for 3 minutes every night, and an artist every month gets to do 3 minutes of something. And so I had this for a month, and I did this project where I put brain imagery on all the screens of Times Square, and it was called Brain City. And it was like drawing parallels between a city and the geography of the brain, right? So as part of that project, we also built a website that created analogies, like from Yelp listings in New York City from different venues, locations, to structures of the brain. And this project got me, it was like a fun, wacky website. You could go and click on like a poetry club and it would take you to a Wikipedia listing for like Broca's area, which generates language production in the brain. And so it was like, you could click on Broca's area listing and it would take you to language areas in New York City. And this was just, we basically like mapped the brain onto a city and vice versa. But one thing that happened along the way is I started to attach some political commentary to these links. So like, there were listings in the brain that took you to listings in New York City that certainly made a statement about one thing or another. And I started to sort of inject some like commentary into that. And I think that eventually led to this project of sort of like imagining a brain space IRL that could then have a sort of layer of commentary attached on top of it. And that's where it came from.
It's really interesting because I mean, there's a lot that's really interesting in that. I do feel that LAPSIS is in some ways a very spatial movie, which like I'm sure doesn't, I don't know if that makes sense. I don't really know how to speak about film as you have experienced in the past, but something about that landscape and the work itself and the sort of, I don't know, there's just something very geographic about it to me. I don't know if that's something that you were thinking about when you were setting up the shot for some of these parts of the film, but it's just interesting to hear you talk about that other project because it does seem like there is some like sort of mapping of ideas onto physical space and sort of understanding relationships between different nodes. I don't know if that's maybe we're going down the wrong.
No, but that's, I mean, that, listen, the actual idea of this quantum trading is spatial in that it takes, I think it's cues mostly from like high frequency trading that deals with geographic distance and the ways in which like a terminal in Trenton, because it's that much closer than a terminal in Chicago to Wall Street, is going to be able to like exact a number of trades at a higher frequency. And so geographic distances, as I read about in thinking about like how this quantum trading would actually work, geographic distances are everything in that world because it's the microseconds that you're like gaming to make to like do these small fractional trades at a high frequency. So cabling, quantum cabling and the invented job in this movie is all about like the spatial relationship and the routes that people get, the longer the route, the shorter the route, what that says about how long you've been cabling. And so like we shot the film in a very contained space. Like we didn't have much forest to work with in terms of what we could get permission to film in, or as much as I would have thought would have shown different landscapes and a journey across different landscapes. So we had to kind of get creative with like, if we reoriented the camera in one scene, like 90 degrees, does this area look like a different area? Like, how could we squeeze space and like stretch space from, so that was just like a challenge of shooting the film. How could we get the most sense of a journey, a spatial journey from a pretty contained piece of forest?
Right, that was sort of like a movie magic.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it did feel expansive and there is that sense of scale that I was wondering about just in terms of how you shot it and the challenges of trying to sort of depict a vast wilderness, knowing that there are often restrictions on shooting in state parks or national parks. What you were saying earlier, just a few seconds ago, about this sort of like invisible network of high frequency trading, basically. Did you find it challenging to depict visually some of these technologies? I mean, I think that you found a really good way of doing it, and so it's kind of a softball question, but I think that it's kind of a high wire act in a lot of ways, both in terms of what we were talking about before with genre, trying to depict social structures and technologies that in many ways are like impossible to satire because they're their own best satire, or they are the dystopian elements are also the realist elements. I think similarly, it can be a little abstract. And so to build a narrative around these sort of abstracted processes or structures, I don't know, it seems incredibly challenging to me. I'm curious how you thought about it visually. And also, just to tack this on since we're here, you wrote the score for the film, and that also seemed like another way of approaching the material in a sort of sensory and embodied way. So yeah, how did you think about sort of bringing this to life when it's one thing to read like a business story, but it's very hard, I think, to make it physical and to make it emotional for people.
Yeah, I think one thing we were faced with was the challenge of people call it like world building, or just sort of giving a sense of what the rules of this, like the logics of the technology are, without having characters lay it all out about how everything works. How can you sort of dole out small cues here and there that for a smart audience will sort of amount to enough at a certain point? And I thought a lot about that, definitely in writing that, and in writing the moments that would happen. And I think one strategy was, and there's a lot of this in the film, there are a lot of videos here and there that people watch, and that snippets of little other media on different screens. And so this was where, like, I think my experience for the last decade as a freelancer, like doing videos for all sort, like nonprofits, startups, commercial edits, like all, like just sort of how I've made my living, to get to make this film. That helped me greatly, because I was able to think like, well, if this, what would the video be playing on this device, and what would it look like, and what kind of animation, what style of animation, whatever. So we created all of that stuff in advance. So every time someone watches a screen or something, there's a little video playing. Often you would use green screen or something, but I think that always looks terrible in movies. I can kind of tell they put it in later. So I wanted to make sure we had all of that stuff created and ready, because it was also great, I thought, for the characters to be able to watch these like instructional videos in real time. So, the training video, I think, was important to kind of like make the abstractions of this job a little more tangible. You see this little character pulling a cabling cart, and the robot catches up and passes it, and then the human passes the cart, and you get the sense of, I think there's a lot in there. There's like the playfulness, the subtle competition and threat, but also just the like great abstraction of something so completely invented and weird, like quantum cabling, comes down to these people just pulling carts through a landscape with like bundles of cable. That I just was hoping would be so clear physically, like the act of people pulling this golf cart essentially through woodlands with this cable unraveling, and then having to receive drops. The physicality of all that I hoped would give a gestalt feeling, that it wouldn't matter if you didn't feel like you knew about the quantum of it all, in any meaningful sense. So I think it was leaning on the physicality and these embedded videos. And then, yeah, you mentioned the score. That was, I think I'd say I created half of the score before we shot. And just like with the videos, it was like, I thought it was helpful to play some of the vibe of the film for people that were coming on in the project, production designer, costume designer, all of our actors, and give a sense of what, tone, because tone is so hard to communicate. The finished tone of the film. Like I've been on different film sets and watched things getting shot, and sometimes you just don't have a sense of what this is going to look like, what this is going to be when it's done. If you see a movie being shot, it's so sort of strange to see people standing around with a camera and filming these little tidbits, pieces of moments. So to give a sense of the music ahead of time was a way to kind of somehow bring us all together. And then I'd say the other half I did after the fact and during the edit.
That's so interesting. It's like you sort of, you're like vibescaping before you started shooting. What you're saying about the videos kind of touches on something else I wanted to ask you about, which is like the hidden labor in a lot of these systems, and how it interacts with the mythology about something like artificial intelligence. Like a lot of what has been marketed and sold as artificial intelligence often is supported by human labor, human digital labor that is very rote and very, very micro, I guess. Like I'm thinking about um, like email assistants and, these sort of like all of this. What is Amazon's program called? I think it's called Mechanical
Turk. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not even trying to find out. But I guess I'm curious, I would imagine that the sort of marketing and hype around artificial intelligence, as someone who is interested in neuroscience, has studied neuroscience and worked on projects involving neuroscience for a decade plus, I would imagine you have strong opinions about this. Do you want to talk a little bit about automation and how you see it, and how the work that you're doing might intersect with or undermine some of the more popular narratives about what something like automation or AI can be?
Yeah, I think one way to get into that is to talk about how we depended on finding a robotics lab to make this film possible. The robots in the film, I had a very definite idea about kind of how we wanted them to look. We didn't want them to look like these new viral videos of these kind of like humanoid or dog-like robots that are frankly kind of eerie sometimes to see from companies like Boston Dynamics.
Yeah.
And I definitely wanted them to feel like a generation removed from that, like maybe more late 90s. And so when we came across this robot, which is called the Rex, with the 6 legs that kind of trundles along and does have some sort of like insect-like quality, we found the lab that makes them, and we went to them and we asked, how could we collaborate, how could we use these robots in the film, and they were able to make it a student program from UPenn, where they sent 4 robotics students and they sort of got credit as they were on set as part of their summer research. So that was very lucky. But I bring all this up to say that in sort of hashing that relationship out, they were very concerned about the way in which automation was going to be depicted in the film. And I had given them the treatment of the film. We had talked about the story. They knew that at one point one of these robots gets smashed, in the film. And the concern was, how are you showing robots? Are robots the evil? Is automation the great evil, and are robots sort of the face of that in this story? And I told them, and I maintain, that automation and the actual physical robots themselves aren't the villain in this story. They're certainly not it's not how I think about it, even in the world as is. I think they are very much an apparatus of something upstream that is the villain. And they are they happen to be the on the ground face of it many times. And the dynamics that I think that have unfolded in our world with companies like Amazon and elsewhere is that there's been a bit of a failure of automation to live up to the initial hype. And I think, going all the way back to the 50s, and then there was an AI winter, and we've sort of come back into this new era of big data rebranded as AI. But it's sort of like, again, I think what's happened is that the driverless technology, robotics, automation, it hasn't lived up to the hype of replacing humans as these ideal workers inside Amazon warehouses or doing deliveries. So we still definitely need humans, right, to be doing the work. But what instead has happened is that I think AI has after its failure, it's turned back on its current mission, which is to be like the perfect hall monitor for humans. So it's sort of like there to coax us along. And I think that's very much how I see automation in this story, as sort of like the competing force that pushes people to go harder and sleep less and challenge their status quo, as it says in the film, in a way that they wouldn't left to their own devices. So that, I think there's a kind of turning back on itself that's happened there with AI. where it's no longer pushing itself to new heights. It's sort of pushing the human now. And to me, it's sort of like the sort of like old maxim, be all that you can be, the army slogan, be all that can be. It's sort of like the end of the year review now, I think, will be the AI sort of like, it's sort of like positioning the human. Were you all that the AI said you could have been all year? Did you do, you know, your best at every turn, and you've had someone watching you the whole time? So that, I think, is the new role of automation. And it's very much like the hall monitor for us. It's like, you know, it's going to push people like it does in Amazon warehouses to take less breaks, to move faster. And what I think the actual like pernicious thing of that in all of this at the end of the day is that ultimately it makes people feel like they are robots. And because they're being, you know, overseen at every step of the way by a technology that is anything but human, it's sort of conforming them to what the AI could have been if it had lived up to its hope, but isn't. So it still needs the human. So it sort of like makes a person, and this, I've actually read quotes from what's going on in Alabama right now, the, you know, workers trying to unionize in this Amazon fulfillment center, saying that the conditions of that center make them feel like robots. So I just think this is, you know, it's interesting, but I think it's kind of unfortunate. It's not interesting in a good way that what's happened is that we've actually sort of like been pushed to achieve what the AI promised it could, but never was able to do.
Yeah, well, and the AI isn't promising anything. I mean, this is corporations that are making the promise on
right.
AI.
Right. The AI is nothing. Right.
Yeah, the AI is not smart enough to promise something. The AI has no sense of expectation. It's interesting that you bring up the Amazon warehouses and the fulfillment centers. Amazon does these free public tours of fulfillment centers as like it has like a very strong Potemkin Village vibe, where it's like, nothing to see here, only happy workers, glad to be working at the Amazon fulfillment center, you know, and like meanwhile it feels like maybe it's a lunch break or something, like it's not totally full to capacity. But I was reading yesterday this article and the information about how Amazon is trying to introduce different little sort of, it's not exactly gamification of the work, although a little bit it is, but it's to introduce like entertainment elements throughout the workday for people who are in fulfillment centers doing very repetitive labor. And they can, if you are successful at these games, which are tied to the work that people are doing, but they can earn, I think that the term that they're using is swag bucks, which is a internal currency that can then be traded in for Amazon branded swag, like a baseball cap or a water bottle. And it was just bizarre to read about this after seeing your film, because there is a very similar incentive structure in LAPSIS in which the workers can earn points basically and trade them in, you know, as if it is a carnival for food or for actually useful tools and such. But it just sort of highlighted for me how there kind of are no new ideas under capitalism. like we will continue to see these very cynical I don't know, for me it's just like, give people more money. They don't need swag bucks, they don't need Amazon stuff. Maybe they'll appreciate it, I don't know, but just pay them. Anyway, I guess I wanted to turn a little bit to Jamie's story in the film. And I'm assuming that everyone who's watching this has seen the movie. I don't have to contextualize it. I'm hoping, because we've just kind of leapt in. I didn't even ask you to do like a summary. Hope that's okay. Everyone should see the film. So I guess I wanted to, Jamie becomes vulnerable to, I don't know, sort of wellness grifters, medical scams. And I guess I wanted to ask you about that universe. And you know, it is very embodied, and it isn't abstracted in the same way as you know, digital networks might be, but there is an overlap between wellness and technology. And I'm just curious what you think about it, if that, you know, how that kind of caught your interest. I imagine some of it originates in like the neuroscience brain research that you've been doing, but yeah, how did that enter the film?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a grift going. This is definitely a film about a world of scams, and from the luggage thing going on earlier in the film to what goes on at this Bar Collider clinic that Jamie gets brought to. I think that is sort of like a Russian doll system of scams ultimately. And I guess I was thinking about a couple things. One, that there are sort of like new conditions in our modern world and chronic fatigue is one of them. Probably has been around for a long time, but there are also conditions that people report to feeling pain due to electromagnetic waves, and there are sort of like a suite of mysterious conditions that people run into a lot of disbelief in, when they tell people about. And so I had been reading about that a bit, and there's sort of a stigma. Certainly there's always been a stigma about mental issues versus physical issues in healthcare, and this catch-all omnia that Jamie is suffering from. First of all, they run into people who don't believe them in the first place, that he even has anything wrong with him. And then when they do go to get treatment, it's like now they found a clinic that believes in it so much they're going to charge tens of thousands to treat it. So I guess it is very real. So it's sort of like that. That switch being flipped is one of the grifts I see in overpriced wellness. And then of course it's like there probably are very reasonable treatments from that world. And it happened in the film. There happens to be a tea that he drinks that he starts feeling better. There probably are very reasonable treatments that would be helpful, but are so severely overpriced and that price out working people like Ray and Jamie from them, so that the whole system where healthcare is not provided as any basic right to these people sort of sets you into these situations where you then get into like a GoFundMe architecture for healthcare. And I see this very much as like omnia as a sort of not just a mysterious malaise, but a sort of reaction to all of these forces not being believed, then feeling the uphill Sisyphusian task of even treating it, and getting to the other side and finding an outcome that works for you given your material conditions. And so that I think all of that was in orbit. But like cabling, I would say that omnia is also in the film. It's just sort of, it is another gestalt of this like world of scams and a reaction to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think also the precariousness of something like working for Cabler, and the way that intersects with like medical debt and even medical debt, that comes from treatments that are effective, not just kind of throwing money into a whole sorts of grifts and empty promises, but just I think one of maybe it's minor, but what can be appealing about companies or working for a company like Lyft or Uber is that they can directly automatically deposit money into your bank account instantaneously. And so there is this feeling that like it's the fastest way to get paid, it kind of puts you on a cycle. And I don't know, I don't know that that's necessarily an example of like tech driving, like the capacity of the technology driving the business model, but I do think that these are sites of often of desperation and of entrapment in a debt cycle. So anyway,
Yes.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but one of the questions that I meant to ask you earlier on, just for the flow of the conversation, so sorry, was just how you did your research for this film. I know that it came from, I now know that it came from a sort of unusual, very Noah specific place, but there was so much about the like the animations and the tone of the marketing materials from Cabler, and the sort of cheerfulness, like the friendliness of its public face, and also just like the precision of the notifications and the sort of incentive, like the little incentivizing nudges. I'm curious if did you sign up for some of these sort of gig work services? How did you research that? Because it felt very accurate to me and it felt very contemporary. And I think that, to go back to what we were talking about earlier on, it can be very hard to narrativize these sorts of things, because they have their own texture. And I think a lot of people know when someone has produced or created something that like doesn't quite get it. And I felt watching this film that like you really did nail it. And so yeah, how did you go about researching that and making sure it was sort of calibrated to be realistic?
It's a good question. I mean, on one hand, I did do a little research. I mean, my brother worked for Postmates for a while, and I would look at his app once in a while, but not, I purposely didn't want to go too deep into looking at real world examples of this stuff, because I didn't, there's a danger in absorbing too much sometimes, because then what you create can be more derivative than original. And I think there's a fine line. I wanted it to feel, hopefully, what you've described, which is that it's calibrated to, it doesn't feel off or something, but it's calibrated to the reality of this industry, but yet feels like it's its own company that exists on that is not just an analog of what already exists. And so the animation style, it was all sort of like evolved and iterated based on taste alone, and it's mysterious what exactly you're responding to after you've gone and checked out other things. But I would say the core idea, and you brought up earlier, like gamification and swag bucks and that sort of culture, and we've kind of talked about it around automation a bit, but the core idea being, these are people who already feel so alienated from the labor they're doing, the product of that labor, that the gamification I came to see and the way the app works and all of these chimes and bells and whistles are sort of a way to like reframe the alienated condition in a pleasurable way. So you sort of like, you're so divorced from your labor, if you can sort of relax into the balm of having an avatar of yourself where it's the rules and logic and rewards are so simple. Get here by this time, get a badge. That for me is, I think, what gamification is trying to do. It's sort of like reframing an already extremely alienated position as a worker in a pleasurable light. And of course that doesn't serve the pleasure ultimately of the worker. I would argue it's sort of like a balm to keep the company inventing new opportunities to deal with the issue of this great alienation and dissatisfaction ultimately, and sort of atomization probably of the worker. And this is actually something from your book, which we're not here to necessarily talk about, but I have to bring it up, which is sort of this idea of companies where there's no vision, things are not looked at as crises. And I think this is a line, there's a line in the book about how the company doesn't look at it as a crisis, it's an opportunity, it's a vision of the future that is just full of opportunities. And that to me is sort of like the ethos of gamification. And it's not just gamification of the tech, it's like, how could every day be Friday? And it's sort of like, how could it just sort of, and I just love that in your book too, of like the ways in which fun is wove, this sort of like idea of fun is provided as a solution to probably deep underlying crises of labor that are creeping in, but aren't going to be issues, because they're just sort of opportunities to add a new badge or a reward to sort of smooth it over and continue on, and to kind of create that like frictionless self that moves from one experience to the next with a whole new realm of incentive structures that we remember from when we were kids playing like Mario Kart.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, every day is Friday, and on Fridays we work from 8 to 8. No, I have, on a more personal note, I have known you for at least a decade. And what was your, but I feel like I've missed some sort of important political evolution, because when we were in our early 20s, we were not talking about labor. We were not talking about capitalism and alienation. And I'm curious what your sort of political education has been in the last decade, or what brought you to make this film. I think when you started working on the Blue Brain documentary in Silico, I think you had a much more optimistic view of technology, and especially technology intersecting with science, and what it could do. And it seems like maybe that perspective has shifted. I'm just sort of curious, what has that trajectory been like for you?
It's true. I mean, my 20s started out one way, and I think ended a very different way politically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the conversation in the film between Ray and Anna at some point, where they're sort of, where he's providing his sort of like, I work just as hard as everyone else, and what do you mean that, what do you mean a head start, whatever, all that sort of stuff. And she pokes back at that and sort of like pokes through that hot air a bit. That has been an active conversation for me that evolved from one side of that conversation more to the other by, I would say, the end of my 20s. And I don't know that any one event accounted for it. I did get into more political work around 2016 through 2018, maybe, that I think maybe had a big impact on me. I worked on a congressional race, and then an attorney general race, doing videos for a candidate. And I sort of, in tandem with that, just sort of started becoming more politically aware. And but it was a certain type of politically aware. It wasn't just, I certainly was pushed more to think about labor and collective action and organizing, as opposed to other forms of being politically aware. Let's say that became most interesting to me. And then I think another dimension of it was, and you bring up my neuroscience documentary in Silico. I started, that was a 10-year film, so I started that film very much in awe and completely sort of taken by the splendors of what was going to be possible in this project, as it had been sold to me and everyone else, kind of. And then that project kind of curdled it and didn't go as planned. And over the decade, I very much shifted in perspective about much of the overselling and salesmanship that I saw as coming mostly from Silicon Valley, but creeping into the sort of corridors of big science, especially with this project, which is trying to simulate the brain on computers. So that curdling of like big tech kind of came in for me with that documentary project. And ultimately, I think I've sort of, these two films, LAPSIS and the documentary in Silico, do have this sort of new interest of mine that has developed over the decade, which is to kind of like be an auditor for where these promises actually have landed in 5 or 10 years down the line, mm-hmm. and the actual worlds they've created for working people. That's sort of become the most interesting thing to me. And I don't, how you get there is sort of like not clear, but that's certainly where I am now. And I absolutely agree. I was not there when we were, having more of our conversations in the early part of that decade.
Yeah, which isn't to call you out. It's not an accusation at all. I think I'm just interested because I think it is a pretty common trajectory for people our age over the past decade. Yeah. And I do think that a lot of these questions have been present in your work, maybe before they were made explicit. Like, I think that your earlier work has focused on the impact of industry on working class people, right? And
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think that is something you've been thinking about a lot, even if it's not necessarily manifest as a thesis.
It's true, but I have to say I'm embarrassed to remember things that I would say at Q&As after showing like one of my oil documentaries. Yeah, I would get up there and I would like both sides the issue. I would get up, you know, I like after showing a film about oil drilling in North Dakota, I'd say like, well, what would it feel like if I was a farmer and all this oil was discovered under my land? You know, that'd be really hard. I don't know what I'd do. I'd sort of like play that role for the audience, and I'm not proud of that, but I think it's interesting to chart as an evolution. I was much less, although maybe those issues were in the films, I was much less ready as a person to decide what I thought about things, and in fact relish the role of sort of like making everyone happy and playing both sides a little bit. And I think now I'm much more sort of eager and ready to just sort of, you know, take a side.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also what you're describing is a challenge of documentary work, of journalism, of nonfiction. So that tension is very familiar to me as someone who writes nonfiction, of sort of wanting to understand everyone's perspective, everyone's involved, and sort of what incentives are they beholden to, and what
Yes, yeah,
worldview they're coming from. All right, I think we probably have to wrap up. So I have one last question for you. You've worked in narrative film now. You've worked in documentary film. What's next? What are you excited about?
I think I'm going to continue doing narrative film for the next beat. I've already written a new script. I'm also thinking about how to maybe adapt LAPSIS into episodic series.
Cool.
Set in the same world, but probably with different characters,
Mm-hmm.
and to explore all of these things we've been talking about even more. I would, you know, I still would love to get back into documentary at some point, but having just finished this 10-year doc, I have to come up with I have to be sure that whatever topic I get into next I'm definitely pumped up about. So right now I'm doing a lot of writing. Yeah.
Great. Well, Noah, thank you. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Anna. It's really a pleasure to talk, and people need to check out your book as well, Uncanny Valley. So people should go check out Uncanny Valley. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for doing this.